and welcome back to another video on my channel. Today's video is going to be a missing persons case because I feel like lately I've covered a lot of cryptids and hauntings and things along those lines, but I haven't really done too many missing persons cases, and so today I decided that I wanted to talk about one of those because that is kind of really what got my channel started. But anyways, the case that I have chosen to talk about today is from South Korea, and this is the first time that I've been visiting a case from there, and because this case is from Korea, my pronunciation obviously is not going to be great throughout this video, so please bear with me with that. But with that all being said, let's get right into today's case. The case that we are talking about today is referred to as the Frog Boy case, and again, this takes place in South Korea. This took place on March 26, 1991, which was actually a public holiday in Korea at that time because this was the day that the democratic election was taking place for the first time in 30 years. Because it was a public holiday, that obviously means that none of the kids had school, and that is when 6 boys decided that they were going to spend the day together. These 6 boys were very, very close. They lived very close to each other, and they usually spent their days off hanging out with one another. And this group consisted of Woo Chal-won, who was 13 years old, Jo Hoo-yen, who was age 12, Kim Young-yu, who was age 11, Park Chan-in, age 10, Kim Tae-ryong, who was 10, and Kim Jong-sik, who was 9 years old and was the youngest of the group. These boys were extremely close. They usually spent their days off together hanging out and doing what normal young boys do, just hanging out, causing trouble, you know, the natural stuff that boys between the ages of 9 and 13 usually get up to. They attended the same elementary school, their families were friends, they were very, very close. The elementary school that they went to was in the Seo district of Daegu, South Korea, and again, they were just super close. They were all very young, and they had a really good time always hanging out with one another, so that is what they usually spent their free time doing. On that morning, the boys were all playing outside of Ho-yen's house when all of a sudden a neighbor complained that the 6 boys were just being absolutely way too loud. Because of this complaint, the boys had decided that they were going to play somewhere else outside of the neighborhood so that they wouldn't disturb anybody and they wouldn't get any more complaints. At this time, while the boys were leaving the neighborhood, that is when Ray Tae-young decided to separate from the group. That morning he hadn't eaten breakfast, and by this time he was starving, so he decided that he was going to go home while the rest of the boys went to do whatever they were going to get up to that day. At this time, the boys had decided that they were going to go up Mount Wooyoung to look for salamander eggs. While on their way up the mountain, they ran into one of the 5 boys' brothers, and that is when they kind of told the brother the plan for the day, and then the brother continued on his way, and the 5 boys continued on their way up the mountain. At this time, Tae-ryong had returned back to the group. However, once he found out that the boys had planned on going up the mountain, he then separated from the group again because he wasn't allowed to go that far from his house. So he just decided to do something in the area in order to avoid getting in trouble with his parents. It was now around 1 p.m. when Woo Chal-won's father got a phone call from his son's Taekwondo academy saying that his son had never shown up for his classes that day. After hearing this, the father then started to ask if any of the other 5 boys had showed up, and when he heard that they hadn't, all of the fathers kind of contacted one another, and that is when they decided to get together and go down to the village to search for their sons and kind of figure out why they hadn't shown up to Taekwondo that day. Once the fathers had gotten to the village, that is when they started to kind of ask around, trying to figure out if anybody knew where their kids could be, and that is when they found out that their sons had a plan on going up the mountain, and so naturally the fathers decided to head up the mountain as well to see if they could find the boys themselves. Now, the way that this mountain was kind of set up, I guess, is one side there was a pond and a farm, and on the other side there was a military shooting base. Now, the military shooting base does come into play a lot at the end, so keep that in mind. But at this point, the fathers just thought that maybe something had happened with one of the farm animals and one of the boys got hurt, so they couldn't get down the mountain, and so they headed up there in hopes of finding their son. What's so perplexing about this, and something to keep in mind again throughout the case, is the fathers had gotten up the mountain and they searched that entire area for several hours with absolutely no sign of the boys whatsoever. After the sun started to set, that is when they decided that this situation was serious enough that they now needed to contact the police. Sadly, like we see in so many cases similar to this one, once the police were informed of the boys' disappearance, that is when they told the parents that they believed that the boys had run off and that they would return and to just leave it because they were pretty certain that the boys would show up in the next couple of days. However, that never happened. The boys never did show back up. And in this case particular, the police work is absolutely horrible. I can't even understand how the police have not gotten criticized more for this case because the police work is so terrible. On March 29th of 1991, just a few days after the boys had gone missing, John Sick's family received a phone call saying that these people had the boys and that they wanted ransom from them and that they would meet the family at this random train station that was located on the outskirts of town. But obviously, once the police and the families had arrived at this train station, nobody ever showed up, and it later turned out that this phone call was a complete hoax. About 5 days after the boys had gone missing, that is when the media started to kind of pick up on the boys' case, and the first article that was written about the boys' disappearance was titled, "5 Boys Go Missing While Searching for Frog Eggs," and that is how this case got the name The 5 Missing Frog Boys, or Frog Boys. What's crazy to think though is that even during all of this time, 5 days after the boys had disappeared, the police still weren't giving this case much attention. They were adamant that they thought that the boys ran away and that they were pretty certain that the boys would show back up. However, the 5 boys' parents knew the boys inside and out. Obviously, they raised them from when they were babies, and they knew that their boys had not run away, they wouldn't run away, and that something much more serious was going on here. However, because of the police's lack of concern in this case, the parents really had to put in extra work themselves. They printed out flyers with the boys' faces on them, they appeared in articles, and they even at one time appeared on a TV show. I can't imagine how devastating this part of the case was to the parents, but anyways, they decided to appear on this TV show because obviously that would get more attention for their son's cases. And on top of that, this TV show talked about missing people, and they had a call center. So while you were on TV talking about your loved one who might have been missing, there was a call center so people could call in and give tips about that person's disappearance if anybody had any. So while the 5 boys' parents were on TV, that is when the call center received a phone call from the boys' school. The person on the line was crying hysterically and asking for their mother, and that is when this person on the line claimed to be John Sick's. However, this caller ended up hanging up before John Sick's mother could make it to the phone. They were able to trace back this call and call the person who had called them back, and obviously, like I already mentioned, this phone call had come from the boys' school. And after they found that out, it turned out that this phone call was some kind of sick prank from one of the children that had gone to the same school as all 5 of these boys. Now, this is just absolutely sickening. I really don't understand why people feel the need to do stuff like this in so many of these cases, but because this was on live TV, this specific incident did end up getting this case a lot of media attention and a lot of attention from the public. Still, at this point, the police were not paying any attention to this case, but because of the media attention and the public attention that was now on this case, it kind of forced the police to at least pretend that they were investigating the situation. And so shortly after the parents had appeared on this TV show, that is when a huge search was set up, and all of these people were sent into the mountains to search for the boys. This search was absolutely huge. There was tons of people in the mountains looking for these boys, and a lot of these people were professionals. There was a lot of police officers and military and just a lot of voluntary searchers and things along those lines, but there was tons of people searching these mountains. And what makes this so strange is even with all of those hundreds of people out there searching the mountain, they still found absolutely zero sign that the boys were even up there. Once this case had started to get more media attention, that is when people started calling in saying that they had actually seen the boys going up the mountain. One woman had called in and said that she was walking near the boys while they were headed up the mountain, and she overheard them saying that they would need to head home within 2 hours of when she had heard them having this conversation, just kind of confirming that the boys had in fact gone up the mountain, like they told their friends that they were going to do. Again, the police in this case were just doing an absolutely terrible job. They weren't doing all that they could, and so because of this, the fathers of the boys decided that they were going to take the case into their own hands. While deciding this, that is when all 5 fathers quit their jobs and they bought this van, and they wrote information about their sons on the outside of the van and covered it in the boys' faces with things like "Have you seen me?" written on it. And they drove this van around trying to get more attention for their sons' cases in hopes of finding information, obviously, that would lead them to where their sons were. Something I found extremely strange and particularly interesting in this case is that while driving around this truck, the boys' fathers were holding press conferences and things along those lines. And while holding these press conferences, there was always these people there. These people were pretending to be reporters, and they followed the dads around absolutely everywhere they went. But it had turned out that these reporters were not reporters at all. They had actually worked for an intelligence agency, and for whatever reason, they were following the boys' fathers absolutely everywhere. They were always at the press conferences. They were always wherever the fathers went, just kind of watching them and again pretending to be reporters. After driving around in this truck for 3 years, the boys' fathers really needed to get back to what was now their normal life. Obviously, they still really cared about their sons and they wanted to find them, but they could no longer just dedicate their lives to driving around this van. They needed to try and create some normalcy. They needed to get their jobs back, but the media really scrutinized them for this, saying that they didn't believe that they cared about the boys anymore, or that they didn't care enough to continue driving around in this van, when obviously that is not the case. But anyways, shortly after the fathers had returned home, the media and the public really started to lose any interest in this case because it had been going on for so long, and the parents were having a really hard time getting the media's attention on their boys. Over those 3 years that the boys had been missing, the main theory in this case that kind of came from the public as well as the boys' family was that the military had something to do with the boys' disappearance. Again, that military shooting base was located on the mountain right where the boys were headed, and so many people believed that this was some kind of military cover-up. And what made this even more suspicious was that the police absolutely refused to even talk to the people on the military base that day. They didn't want to look at them. They didn't want to entertain this thought at all whatsoever. This is probably the weirdest thing that I've ever heard in a missing persons case that I'm going to share with you guys next. It absolutely blows my mind and kind of seals one theory in this case for me, and I will talk about that at the end. But just beware, because this next thing that I'm going to tell you guys is one of the strangest things that I've ever heard in any of these cases. So once the boys' fathers had returned home from looking for their sons after those 3 years, and once the case kind of started to die down in the media and the public eye, that is when the families of the 5 boys were contacted by the military. Now, they weren't contacted at a normal time during the day. They were called by the military in the very dead middle of the night. When they were called by the military in the very middle of the night, they were told to come to the military base right now in the dead middle of the night. That was all the way up the mountain, but these 5 families obviously were desperate to find their kids, and so being called by the military, they all kind of got together and they headed up the mountain to the military base. Once they got there, they were greeted by members of the military and they were brought into this very small room. Now buckle in, because this next bit of information is going to really probably confuse you. Once all of the families were in the room, that is when one of the military officers had told them that they were going to be given superpowers in order to help them find their sons. Not every single one of the family members was going to be given superpowers, but one of them would be, and it would lead them to the children. Now, I don't know about you guys, but this was really giving me like Stranger Things kind of vibes while I was researching this case, but this is just absolutely, I've never heard anything like this in any other case that I've ever researched ever. Allegedly, after telling the families this, that is when the military put on this really weird kind of like performance, and they walked up behind the family members and they placed their hands on the parents' heads, and that is when one of the mothers started screaming. They said that she was screaming as if she was in a trance, and that is when the military kind of took their hands off of everybody's heads, and they said that she was the chosen one and she had these superpowers, and now she was going to lead them to where the boys were. Once they said this, the mother ran out of the military base, out of the room that she was in, followed by other military officers as well as the other parents, and she ran up the mountain, and finally she just stopped And she said, "Our boys are here." But once they searched the area, obviously, as you've probably guessed, the boys were not there. And this whole thing seemed to be some kind of sick joke that was performed by the military. And after this, the case just kind of went cold, and nothing too much else really came about where the boys could have been for quite a while. Next part isn't of too much importance to the case, so I don't want to dive into it too deeply, but I do just want to brush the surface of it because I can't believe that so many absolutely insane things happened in one case that are just so heartless, I want to say. But this was on January 12th of 1996 when one of the father's parents was contacted by a man who claimed that he was a psychology professor who had studied in America. This man, who had contacted one of the families, had said that he had studied this case profusely and that he was positive that John Sick's father had murdered the 5 boys. This man had random specific details that made absolutely no sense to the case, but he had told everybody, including the media, that John Sick's father had murdered the 5 boys and that they were now buried underneath his home. Police got wind of this and they decided to investigate, and they ended up digging up John Sick's family's home. Can you believe that? But after they did this, obviously they found absolutely nothing because this man was just talking nonsense. And when they dug up the ground, obviously the media was there was tons of police officers and public, and when they didn't find anything, this man, the professor who said that he had studied in America, took off running through the crowd as if trying to escape the police because it seemed as if he had known that nothing would be there. He was just putting these families through that stress for absolutely no reason. Sadly, shortly after this, John Sick's father had ended up passing away due to liver cancer, and many people believed that this cancer was caused by all of the stress that was brought on by his son going missing, and then on top of that, people accusing him of having something to do with it. The man was just so stressed out, and I can't even believe that somebody would do that. It's just absolutely so messed up to want to hurt these people who are already hurting that much more. Then on September 26, 2002, the boys' remains were discovered on Mount Wuyang, right very, very close to where they had initially been kind of looking for those salamander eggs, right where everybody had been searching for them. And the state in which the boys' remains were found is a little bit strange. When the boys were found, their shirts were all tied together by their sleeves, and when the police untied the sleeves of the boys' shirts, inside there were unused bullets and cartridges that were just laying, again, inside of the boys' clothes that had been tied up to their sleeves of their shirts. All of their shirts were tied together. On top of that, the crime scene was just handled absolutely terribly. Police had come in and dug up the boys' remains without the forensic team arriving just yet, and they had called the parents in before calling in the forensic team, and they were letting the boys' parents handle the remains, and it was just handled absolutely horribly. There are so many absolutely insane aspects to this case, but one that absolutely blows my mind is that before the forensic team had even arrived to this scene, the chief of police went public and said during a press conference that the boys had been found and that their cause of death was determined to be hypothermia. But that wasn't the case. Nobody had even determined the boys' cause of death just yet at this time. Now, obviously, while listening to this, you probably have figured out by now that hypothermia doesn't make sense as the cause of death. On the night that the boys had disappeared, it was about 3 to 5 degrees. However, the boys were close enough to their home that if it was that cold, which it wasn't, they could have just walked down the mountain and gone home. So if they were that cold, why didn't they do that if that was the case? On top of that, when the boys' remains were found, they were buried, and again, their clothes were all tied together, which doesn't make sense if the boys had passed away due to natural causes. The boys' remains were found 100 to 200 miles away from that military shooting range, and again, the media was really running with the theory that the military was involved in this case. And another thing to keep in mind is that military guns can shoot a very far range, which would be within the range of where the boys' bodies were found and where the military range was. However, because the media was running with this theory so much, the military had held their own press conference saying that yes, the bullet casings that were found around the boys were theirs, both of the used and unused bullet casings that were found around the boys did belong to the military. However, they said that they had nothing to do with the boys' murder. They said that this was a public holiday, and so because of that, the shooting range would be closed and none of the military would be there. However, commissioned officers do have access to the shooting range at any time that they want. That includes holidays. And it has since been confirmed that there was a commissioned officer in the shooting range that day who had fired off his rifle. But nobody really ever looked into this, and we don't know very much information about that officer or anything like that because the police still never looked into the military and they never looked into this officer for this case. Something to keep in mind here is none of the boys' remains had bullet wounds, confirming that the boys had never been shot, but there was damage shown on the boys' bones. Police had just said that these bruises and damage that was caused to the bones had been caused after the boys had passed away. However, many other people who were investigating this case were not so convinced. So many pictures were taken of the boys' remains and they were shipped off to an anthropologist in America. This anthropologist determined that these bruises and the fractures to the boys' skulls were caused before the boys had passed away, and that these damages and bruises and whatnot were man-made, and that the boys had passed away from blunt force trauma to the head. It was also determined that the boys' remains were in that exact spot the entire time that the boys' families had been looking for them. And that is really all that there is on this case. The cause of death for the boys has been determined to be from natural causes, which a lot of people are obviously extremely unhappy with. My heart sincerely goes out to the loved ones and the family of these 5 boys. This case is absolutely sickening and so frustrating and heartbreaking. And it is really frustrating. I can't even imagine being a family member or a loved one of one of these boys and not getting answers and just kind of being told to move on. It is just absolutely heartbreaking. But guys, that really brings us to the end of today's video. Let me know what you think of this case down below. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to comment down below what you'd like to see in my future videos. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so that you don't miss any future videos from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys!